Good evening, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website weather.gov/Alaska, get any updates to the forecast through that means, or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we might have out for your area. Also call our weather info line, 1-800-472-0391, get any updates to the forecast through that means as well. And you can email me at the address at the bottom of the screen, david.kramer@noaa.gov. Taking a look now, we do have one advisory out, and that is a winter weather advisory primarily for snow for northeastern portions of the Brooks Range. That does go in from Wednesday night until Friday morning, more specifically 10 p.m. on this evening, and that's going to go until 4 a.m. on Friday. That's going to be in that time range that covers all of Thursday, 4 to 8 inches, with the majority of that being further off to the east and east of the Dalton Highway in particular. Now, as we look ahead in this at the actual snow amounts, you can see some areas up by Kaktovik going to see 4 to 6 inches more further to the east. Arctic Village going to see 4 to 6 inches as well, with some areas surrounding there going to get up to that 8 amount. But as we get over into the pass, Adigan Pass only going to see about 1 to 2 inches, and Dead Horse and Prudhoe Bay 2 to 3 inches are expected. Down in the Panhandle, we also had some stronger winds, especially in the southern locations. And this was Wednesday morning. Winds are continuing to diminish as we move throughout the day. And we did have some gusts up to 45 miles per hour at Metlakatla and Salmon Landing. We had 56 miles per hour, Ketchikan 50, and Cape Decision up to as high as 52 miles per hour. Some areas in the inside waters are getting up into the 50s as well. A little bit lower there at Lincoln Island, 44 miles per hour there this morning. Taking a look now at our satellite imagery, we'll start off in the Gulf of Alaska, where we have multiple lows moving through the area, bringing up quite a bit of cloud cover along the North Gulf Coast and down into the Panhandle area. If we look at the cloud cover extending in over mainland Alaska, we can see a deformation zone forming as we look up into the interior, where we are going to see some precipitation from that as it stretches out over the Brooks Range and down through southwest Alaska. And then as we look way out to the west, we have another weaker low moving out by the western Aleutian Islands, bringing some cloud cover and rain to the area. And finally, we'll look over the eastern portion of the Bering Sea, where the northerly winds are bringing some showers and lower cloud cover out throughout much of the northern and eastern portions of the Bering. Taking a look now at our weather for the remainder of the day, staying out over the Bering Sea, those northerly winds bringing some rain showers out through much of the Bering down into the Aleutian Islands and Alaska Peninsula. Further out west are weaker lows by the western Aleutian Islands, bringing some rain to the area as well. Out over the Gulf of Alaska, multiple low pressure systems spin throughout the area, bringing rain from Kodiak Island up through the North Gulf Coast and throughout all of the Panhandle. As we move further into south central Alaska, most of the precipitation is going to be with the coastal ranges, but as we look at some of the low-lying areas in the interior, going to be a little bit drier there. And then at higher elevations in the mountains, we are going to see some snow. Out in the interior, we're going to continue to see rain for much of the central and eastern locations, and especially as we get further to the north towards the Brooks Range, where we'll start to see a transition over to snow, and then in the Brooks Range and along the Arctic coastline, expecting to see snow for the remainder of the day. As we look into tonight, going to continue to see snow throughout much of the Brooks Range, especially central and eastern locations, and then eastern locations of the Arctic coast. Down through central and eastern interior, going to start to see more snow as our snow levels are going to start to dip to around 2,000 feet overnight tonight. So some of the low-lying areas below 2,000 feet elevation should see primarily rain, but as we get to some of the higher terrain, especially in the mountains, we're going to see primarily snow. Then some areas of fog out over the western portions of the interior, and then down in south central Alaska, transitioning low-lying areas back over to rain with some snow in some of the mountain ranges. Then out over the Gulf of Alaska, more rain is expected all throughout the North Gulf Coast and the Panhandle, and then rain throughout the Bering Sea, Aleutian Islands, and Alaska Peninsula. Into Thursday, we're going to have rain continuing throughout the Bering Sea and Aleutians, and then more rain for central and eastern portions of mainland Alaska. That's going to become snow in the Brooks Range and along the Arctic coastline for eastern locations. More rain is also expected down in the Panhandle and all throughout areas around the Gulf of Alaska. On Friday, pretty similar situation where we have low pressure remaining out over the Gulf, bringing more rain to the Panhandle, North Gulf Coast, Kodiak Island, and then some more light rain in the interior, central and eastern locations, transitioning to snow once again as we get by the Brooks Range and Arctic coastline. Then down over the Bering Sea and Aleutians, more rain we're seeing with the northerly winds, with the new system coming in, bringing a little bit heavier precip to the western Aleutian Islands. For our temperatures, Thursday morning lows going to be near 40 for the Aleutian Islands. In the southwestern portions of the state in the 30s, that's going to extend up into the interior as well. But as we get further to the north, going to start to drop down into the 20s for the Arctic coastline and in the teens for the Brooks Range. Down in south central Alaska, in the 40s are expected, and 40s for much of the Panhandle, near 50 in the south. Thursday afternoon, getting up into the 50s for the Panhandle and south central Alaska, getting up into the 40s for all of southwest and interior, then in the 30s along the Arctic coastline, down in the Bering Sea, Aleutian Islands, and Alaska Peninsula, up into the 40s. Friday morning low is going to drop back down to near 40 for the Aleutian Islands, into the 30s for much of southwest, near freezing for much of the interior, getting in the 20s as we move further to the west near the coastline in Kotzebue Sound, and then just below 30 in the upper 20s there for the Arctic coastline. Down in south central Alaska, temperature is going to drop down into the 40s and into the mid to upper 40s for the Panhandle area. Friday afternoon high is going to jump back up into the 50s for the Panhandle, warmest near the Gulf of Alaska and further to the south, mid-50s for south central Alaska, mid-40s for the interior, lower 40s down in southwest Alaska, near 40 for the Seward Peninsula, right up around freezing for the Arctic coastline, 24 through the pass, and then down in the Aleutian Islands, mid-40s are expected, as well as the Alaska Peninsula. Then for Pribilof Islands, mid-40s as well, with 45 expected for St. Paul.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For aviation, we'll start off with a look at our flying weather on Thursday morning. Out over the central and western portions of the Bering Sea, we're seeing MVFR conditions, and then MVFR conditions for much of the Aleutian Islands and into the Alaska Peninsula. Much of the west coast, however, is going to be under VFR conditions, with some IFR and MVFR up along the Arctic coastline. For central and eastern portions of the mainland, we are seeing primarily MVFR and IFR until we get down into south central Alaska, where the valleys will largely see VFR conditions. Out over the Gulf of Alaska, MVFR and IFR conditions are expected, but VFR conditions for the Panhandle. As we move into Thursday afternoon, some MVFR and IFR conditions are going to move into the Panhandle, with the worst conditions in southern locations, and VFR conditions up further to the north in northern Lynn Canal and up by Haines and Skagway. Out over the Gulf of Alaska, MVFR and IFR conditions expected, with those conditions extending into much of south central. However, the inland areas of the valleys looking to be primarily VFR. Central and eastern portions of the interior are going to be a mixture of MVFR and IFR, and then MVFR and IFR along the Arctic coast. Down much of the western portion of the state, VFR conditions expected. However, the Seward Peninsula will see some MVFR conditions. Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, central and western locations will primarily see MVFR and IFR conditions, but as we get further to the east, VFR conditions are expected. On Friday morning, primarily MVFR and VFR for the Aleutian Islands and for the Bering Sea. However, the west coast of the state still staying primarily VFR. But as we get up towards the Brooks Range area, you're going to start to see a lot of IFR that's going to extend through the Brooks Range and into the Arctic coastline. Central and eastern portions of the interior, primarily IFR. However, the Yukon Flats area should see some VFR areas. Down in south central, a mixture of VFR through IFR conditions, with low-lying areas most likely to see the VFR conditions. And then down in the Panhandle, MVFR conditions are expected. Friday afternoon, continuing to see MVFR throughout the Panhandle area, mixture of IFR and MVFR out over the Gulf, and a lot of MVFR for south central, especially at higher elevations, where low-lying areas are going to continue to see primarily VFR. For the interior, primarily MVFR conditions are expected, becoming IFR as we get to the Arctic coastline. Down much of the west coast, we're going to see primarily VFR conditions, and then MVFR and IFR throughout the Bering Sea and Aleutians. Through the passes, Anaktuvuk will start off IFR, improve to marginal conditions in the afternoon. Adigan should stay down in IFR all day on Thursday. Lake Clark and Merrill should both be MVFR throughout the day. Rainy Pass will start off IFR and then improve to marginal conditions in the afternoon. Windy will be IFR throughout the day Thursday, as well as Isabel Pass. And Memtasta will start off IFR, improve to marginal conditions later. Tanita Pass should be IFR throughout the day on Thursday, as well as at Portage. And then Chilkoot and White should both remain VFR throughout the day Thursday. Taking a look at our freezing levels, we can see a lot of the colder air coming down the west coast of the state, with that surface freezing line making it through the YK Delta area. With some of our warmer air further to the east out over the Gulf of Alaska, some areas up to as high as around 6,000 feet out over the northern Gulf, extending into some of south central Alaska. Taking a look at our icing, with the system moving through the Gulf of Alaska, we are seeing quite a bit of icing around the Gulf, above 8,000 feet for south central Alaska, between 5,000 and 9,000 feet for the Panhandle, and then that continued moisture up through much of the central and eastern portions of mainland Alaska, above 2,000 feet for the interior, below 10,000 feet all along the Arctic coastline. And some of those northerly showers going to bring some isolated areas of icing throughout much of the Bering and Aleutians. However, that will be somewhat sporadic for Thursday. That's going to be between 3,000 and 7,000 feet. So look at our jet stream. The main portion of the jet is to our south, with some areas getting up to as high as 125 knots out of a northwesterly direction south of the Aleutian Islands. However, over the Aleutian, 65 to 70 knots is expected out of a west-northwest direction. Otherwise, we have a jet streak out over the northern portion of the state out of the west to southwest direction around 60 knots. Down to 9,000 feet, not a lot of activity out over mainland Alaska. Some lighter areas around 20 knots out of a somewhat easterly direction, 30 knots out of a south to southeast direction over the Panhandle, 30 knots out of a northwesterly direction near the Alaska Peninsula, and 35 knots south of the Aleutian Islands. Down to 3,000 feet, pretty similar flow, but some of those stronger winds up to as high as 35 knots out over mainland Alaska. Easterly winds up along the Arctic coastline at 35 knots. Moving into the Yukon Flats area to a east to northeast direction, 35 knots. Northerly to northeasterly winds out over southwest Alaska and in the Panhandle, 30 to 35 knots. 20 knots out of a south to southeast direction over the southern portions of the Panhandle, and then northerly winds 30 to 35 knots out over the western Aleutians. For our turbulence, some areas of turbulence with some of the stronger winds were seen out over mainland Alaska, western portions of the Brooks Range below 4,000 feet, for southwest Alaska and the Alaska Peninsula below 4,000 feet, and in the southern portions of the interior, we are going to see some areas of turbulence below 6,000 feet.
I can't really name anyone that has so much integrity as she does to the things that she's accomplishing. It's pretty amazing. Having Claire as a role model, just a strong woman in science and just so smart and so kind. It's just a huge confidence booster is that, hey, I could do that too, you know? That's possible, that's successful, that's what I want to do.
I would characterize her as a pioneer in the field.
The amount and quality of the work she's put out is second to none.
I know people who have a lot of tenacity. I know people that have integrity, but it's rare that people have both together in that, you know, that combination that Claire does.
Every morning, Dr. Claire Parkinson gets up before sunrise and runs 2 miles to work. She hasn't missed a day in nearly 40 years. To know the evolution of sea ice and how we observe it from space is to know Claire. This year, she's celebrating 40 years at NASA.
When I arrived at Goddard, which was in July of 1978, it was an incredibly exciting period here. Satellites were pretty new, but a lot of data had been collected.
NASA scientists were inundated with information, and Claire was in a cohort looking at sea ice, trying to make sense of a jumble of very raw, very new data. It was around that time that Claire and her team, at the time led by Dr. Jay Zwally, created the principal sea ice record that we use today.
How does something like that record help you do your job?
Oh, that record is fundamental to understanding sea ice. So without it, we wouldn't know how rapidly it's changing.
You may not realize it, but Claire's work studying the changing extent of the ice caps deeply affected our understanding of climate change, and relatedly, our understanding of how climate change affects life on Earth.
One of the clearest signals for climate change that resonates with people has been this shrinking of the polar ice cap in the summer that we're able to see because of Claire's work.
After we had a record that was about 15, 20 years long, we started noticing that the extent of the ice in the Arctic was getting smaller over time.
Sea ice is formed on the surface of the ocean, and therefore is made from seawater. the biggest concentration is in the Arctic, and it's also where the biggest loss in sea ice is occurring. Every year, NASA reports on the sea ice minimum and maximum extents. As expected, the data is concerning.
By now, not only has this trend toward lesser ice continued, but it's even accelerated, so that now the decreases are greater than what they had been.
These trends are deeply troubling, but one thing's for sure. Our awareness of shrinking sea ice extent due to climate change was propelled faster and further after Claire Parkinson arrived at NASA.
I mean, she takes her job seriously, and the health and welfare of those instruments in space, yeah, she's on it. You know, it's one of the things you don't worry about because Claire's in the loop on these things. It's going to be fine.
In science, we stand on the shoulders of giants, on the shoulders of those who explored before us. But then, some among us are giants.
For a scientist, it's incredibly exciting to be studying these glaciers and ice sheets right now because they're doing something that hasn't happened in thousands of years. We're watching changes take place that haven't happened since the end of the last ice age. Tuesday was cold, I almost froze my toes. Oh, what's it gonna be next week? Who knows? That's climate. Oh, that's the climate you got. You take a bunch of weather and you average it together and you're doing the climate rock.
At a glacial pace, it means something's happening so slowly you can barely tell it's happening at all. That used to describe the very incremental movement glaciers and ice sheets experienced each year. But now that's changing. We're tagging along with 3 NASA scientists to understand the different lengths they go to not only investigate ice sheets and glaciers, but also communicate their often complicated science to the public. First, let's get oriented. Ice sheets, in pink, pretty much occur in only 2 places, Antarctica and Greenland. Glaciers, in yellow, play a key role draining melt off the ice sheet. Glaciers are also found in the high mountains, but we'll get to those in another episode.
So we know that something's happening in Greenland right now that's unprecedented in the last several thousand years.
That's Dr. Josh Willis, oceanographer at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Josh and his team are tackling one of the major environmental challenges of the 21st century, trying to answer fundamental questions about how melting glaciers impact sea level rise.
With my mission, Oceans Melting Greenland, or OMG for short, we're trying to understand just how much of Greenland's melt is caused by the oceans.
Along with being one of NASA's top scientists working on the cryosphere, Josh is passionate about demystifying climate change in typically unconventional ways.
I think by reaching out to people with a little bit of humor, a little bit of fun, maybe a song, you really have the opportunity to help people understand and come to terms with what we're doing to our planet. Because it's definitely happening and it's definitely a big deal, and we need to start preparing for it.
Down at the opposite pole, Dr. Kelly Brunt is getting ready for a major expedition.
In December and January this coming year, I'll actually be in Antarctica, down near the South Pole, collecting ground-based GPS data.
This is actually Kelly's second expedition to the South Pole. The first occurred in December and January of last year. Both surveys are critical and will help validate data collected by NASA's airborne campaign, Operation Icebridge, and the recently launched satellite mission ISAT-2.
All 3 of these layers, that ground-based, that airborne, and the satellite, are all tied together. The ground-based helps validate both the satellite and the the airborne helps give us more validation data for the satellites, but also a bigger story with respect to the depth of the ice sheet and what's going on underneath the surface.
While some scientists are taking measurements in the field, others are looking for answers in physics and lines of code.
For me, those projections that we are doing, they do have a very personal meaning.
Dr. Sophie Nowicki is an ice sheet modeler. That means she and her team have the important job of forecasting how ice will change in the future, which also predicts changes in sea level rise. It's a job she doesn't take lightly, especially since urban planning and infrastructure use her team's models to make decisions about the future and safety of their communities.
When we make those projections that are 100 years in the future, 100 years can seem so far away, like I don't have to worry about it, it's just too far. But actually they are not. It's really like the future that we are looking at that our children or grandchildren will see to experience.
Whether it's learning to communicate in new ways, traversing a swath of Antarctica in a massive piston bully, or taking responsibility for an impactful climate forecast, our NASA explorers are pushing the limits of discovery every day. But on a very human level, they're people with families and friends who have a stake in finding out why and how the planet is changing as rapidly as it is.
Every place, at least so far, that we have found life, we found water along with it. And so when we try to understand the thresholds for life, where life might exist, elsewhere in our solar system and the universe, water is one of those things that we look for.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back for the marine section. We'll start off with a quick look at the ice edge. Not a lot of change, except that we do have some new ice growth in the Chukchi, and navigational waters still remain ice-free. Looking down in southeast on Thursday, we have south to southeast winds in all areas. In the inside waters, we have 20 knots in the south, but dropping down to 10 knots for central and northern locations. Out over the Gulf, 25 knots in the far eastern areas, and then 15 to 20 as we get further to the north. On Friday, continuing to see south to southeast winds in all locations. Out over the Gulf waters, all around 20 knots. Seas highest in the eastern Gulf waters, around 10 feet. Then in the inside waters, 15 to 20 knots are expected, strongest again in areas further to the south. On Thursday, out over the Gulf waters from south central Alaska, 20 knots are expected, easterly winds up north, becoming northerly in the western locations. Prince William Sound, northeasterly winds 15 knots expected. In Cook Inlet, north to northeast winds 10 to 15 knots, getting up to as high as 20 knots out of a northwesterly direction west of the Barren Islands. Then on Friday, 15 knots out of a northeasterly direction in the Cook Inlet area, becoming north 15 west of the Barren Islands, west 15 east of the Barren Islands, and then out over the rest of the Gulf, we're going to have easterly winds 15 to 25 knots, strongest in the northern waters. In the Prince William Sound area, northeast winds 15 knots expected. Out over the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island area on Thursday, northwest winds 20 to 25 knots, strongest out over the Pacific waters, and seas highest there as well, up to as high as 8 feet near Kodiak Island. Then on Friday, flow circulating around a low pressure system. Out over the Bering, north to northwest winds 15 to 20 knots. Then out over the Pacific side, west to northwest winds 15 to 20 knots. And then Shelikof Strait, northerly winds 10 knots expected. Out over the Aleutian Islands on Thursday, we're going to see northwesterly winds 15 to 20 knots for the eastern Aleutian Islands, westerly winds 15 knots for the central Aleutian Islands, and north to northwest winds 20 knots out by the western Aleutians. Then on Friday, out over the western Aleutians, west to northwest winds 15 to 25 knots, strongest further to the west. Central Aleutians, westerly winds 10 to 15 knots, and in eastern Aleutians, northwest winds 15 knots expected. Down the west coast of the state, northerly winds 15 to 20 knots, strongest by Nunavik Island. St. Matthew Island, northwest winds 10 knots, and the Pribilof Islands, northwesterly winds 15 knots expected. On Friday, still northerly winds along the west coast, 20 to 25 knots, strongest by St. Lawrence Island. Northeasterly winds 20 knots by the St. Matthew Island area, and then southeast winds 10 knots by the Pribilof Islands. Seas up to as high as 9 feet, highest near the Bering Strait area. For Thursday, along the Arctic coastline, we do have northeasterly winds 20 knots, dropping down to 15 knots by Utqiagvik area, down the west coast, 20 to 30 knots, strongest by the Point Hope area, and then northerly winds 15 knots past the Bering Strait. On Friday, continuing to see north to northeast winds along the west coast of the state, 20 to 25 knots are expected, seas up to as high as 9 feet near the Bering Strait, and then northeasterly winds 15 to 20 knots along the Arctic coast. For tonight's weather, quick recap, we have low pressure out over the Gulf waters. That's bringing rain from Kodiak Island area through the North Gulf Coast down into the Panhandle area. We're going to see some continued showers over central and eastern portions of the mainland, with snow dropping down to as low as 2,000 feet elevation, but it should be rain beneath that. And then in the Brooks Range, we're going to see snow, and up in the eastern portions of the Arctic coastline, also going to see snow. We do have the winter weather advisory out for snow for eastern portions of the Brooks Range. It's going to be in effect from 10 p.m. this evening until 4 a.m. on Friday. That's for 4 to 8 inches, highest amounts east of the Dalton Highway, and the highest ones overall are going to be farthest to the east, even east of Kaktovik in some locations. Then down out over the Bering Sea, we have northerly winds bringing rain showers to the Bering and Aleutian Islands, as well as the Alaska Peninsula. On Thursday, continued rain showers for the Bering Sea and Aleutians. Then we'll have our lows hanging out still over the Gulf waters, bringing more rain to Kodiak Island, the North Gulf Coast, and the Panhandle areas, as well as more rain for the central and eastern portions of the interior, and then snow for the central and eastern portions of the Brooks Range and Arctic coastline. Finally, on Friday, more snow for the Arctic coast. However, a mix of rain and snow as we get to areas from Utqiagvik further to the west. Some lighter rain for much of the central and eastern portion of the interior. However, as we get further to the north in the interior, still going to transition over to snow. Low pressure still remaining out over the western portion of the Gulf of Alaska, bringing more rain to some areas around Bristol Bay, Kodiak Island, south central Alaska, and the Panhandle, as well as some areas of snow in the mountain ranges around south central Alaska. Then out over the Bering Sea and Aleutians, we have a new low coming in from the west, bringing in some rain for the western Aleutians, and then some lighter showers out ahead of this system for much of the remainder of the Bering Sea, Aleutian Islands, and Alaska Peninsula.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.